person that they avert their eyes from is a human being deserving justice. But that work is work that can be taken up today, now, and it's work that both addresses and perhaps converts others, but it redeems ourselves in a way that I think is really, really important and is an example. The last thing I want to say, I'm probably talking too long. As a historian, I've always been puzzled by the way in which people have taken this period of the civil rights movement, what's called the classic civil rights movement, part of the freedom struggle, and said, well, that was fine for that moment, but really, you can't change a society, you can't convert a government, you can't overcome injustice with nonviolence, you can't change people who hate with love. And I think that's meant then that people are confused about what the civil rights movement in fact was about. Was it about securing rights? Was it about gaining legal protections? Was it about realizing the beloved community? I think this biography, and I said this before when we were in conversation, and I really think it's a profound accomplishment. I think this biography makes clear that something that is so important about this period of the freedom struggle was that it enabled Black people, and ultimately all that would ally with them, to understand that the fight was more than a fight for rights, more than a right fight for justice, more than a right for transforming the actions and policy of government. It was a fight to live with one's fear and make sure that that fear did not prevent one from being able to realize change. I want you to stop and just sit with that for a minute, because the heroic king tells us that, you never have to be afraid. The heroic Malcolm X tells us that you never have to be afraid. The reality of both racism and political struggle is that oftentimes you have to live with fear in order to realize change. Oftentimes you have to find a way to confront the ways in which you think something is impossible, or someone might harm you, or someone might exercise greater power over you than you believe that you have, but then you still show up to try to find a way to realize that change. And this is an idea that you can find in Frederick Douglass, and Ida B. Wells, and Howard Thurman, the theologian who was such an important resource to King. I think you can find it in almost every prominent example, personally, of struggle in relation to Black rights and most other rights traditions. And King himself, we know from this biography, was living with fear because for so many instances, and they're documented in the book through the tapes, he recognized that he was a marked man. He was marked for death. He knew that as early as Montgomery in 1955. And yet he continued to push himself and respond to other people pushing him, and he pushed other people to join with him and show up in the face of that uncertainty about whether he would be able to continue to live. And he did not continue to live. I think that response to fear, which of all else is honest, is something that we need to call on now. We are anxious. We are uncertain. And I think many of us, at least at some moment or another, feel scared. But it's how you live with that that equips you to be able to realize great change. And I think that that is something that we need to internalize and draw from. And with that, I'll stop, and we'll continue the conversation.
I believe that the two sweetest words in the English language are the words thank you when they are sincerely uttered. So let me begin by saying thank you, Reverend Desagier, University Church, these wonderful panelists and new colleagues. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this conversation. I am the president and professor of public theology at Chicago Theological Seminary right here in the neighborhood. And I think it is fitting, and I know my colleague at CTS, Dr. Smith, may pick this up and develop it, to mention that in 1957, Chicago Theological Seminary was arguably, I think, the first, certainly progressive seminary in the United States of America to award Dr. King an honorary doctorate, again in 1957. So this is a legacy, this is a connectivity that we celebrate very much at Chicago Theological Seminary. So I wanted to note that. I'm a professor, so there is a thesis. Here's my thesis. Superheroes and mythic characters float above history, time, and place. But mere mortals like you and me do things like sit at the dinner table with family and talk. What would happen to us? What would happen to our freedom fighting if we refuse to engage in the veneration of superheroes and mythic figures, but realize that the ever-needed cause of freedom fighting will be made possible by mere mortals like you and me who sit at dinner tables and eat with family? That's the lens through which I view this conversation. Let me locate myself. You already know where I work. I live in Bridgeport because time and place, like hyperlocality, being real specific, is very important, I think, for freedom fighting. So prior to walking through the doors here, I had a number of experiences today. I sat at a dinner table with my wife in our home. My mother and father-in-law flew in from Virginia, so my mother-in-law was there. And I had a brilliant text exchange with our daughter. I am the proud father of a 19-year-old disturber of the universe. Her name is Karis, and she is a second-year undergraduate at Yale University, majoring in women's gender and sexuality studies. The reason I say that is today, I had sense, I want to show you how smart I am, to have major conversations with my wife, my mother-in-law, and our daughter. The reason that I do that is I want to sleep well tonight, and I don't want the ancestors to disturb my sleep. Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Diane Nash, Mrs. King, that is the mother and the spouse. And I wanted to, of course, problematize the fact that you have 4 male-presenting people talking about a male figure, because we got to make sure we talk about the sisters and gender non-conforming people and building thick coalitions locally, because superheroes and mythic figures do all of this by themselves. But I am who I am because there have been days when I, as a theologian, a preacher who's written books and was the pastor of the Riverside Church where Dr. King wanted to be. That was where James Lawson told me King wanted to go to Riverside, but the bullet stopped that. There have been days when I could not hope for myself. There have been days when I was terribly afraid, and it was Lizetta, or was it Coretta? My wife's name, Lizetta. Dr. King's was Coretta. Let me say it to you this way. Our daughter, Karis, knows that my favorite quotation is from Dr. King. And we have developed this little experience now that's been going on since she was 3 years old, and I'll give it to you this way. The first thing that I do with our daughter, because if we're going to change the world, we got to build coalitions. We got to do it in a thick, humane way. And speaking to this particular moment and the presidential election, if folks of our generation don't get Generation Z, the game is lost anyway. So that's the reason I'm talking about a Generation Z freedom fighter who happens to be my daughter, who is a woman. And if that's not part of the King legacy, I don't know what is, because he was enmeshed in thick coalitions of women who were often not celebrated, shucks, not even mentioned. So we must talk about that. Since Karis was a little girl, 3, I knew she was a disturber of the universe. So we began this little daily exercise. I say to Karis every day, Karis, be a leader for, and I pause, and Karis fills in the word righteousness. Be a leader for righteousness. Because you can be a leader for all kinds of things, and there are a lot of current public leaders who are leaders for foolishness. So we cannot simply tell in the legacy of King our young people to be leaders. Be specific, because remember, superheroes and mythic figures float above time and space and specificity. I'm trying to be real specific with this freedom fighter. And so across the years, she has heard me say over and over and over again, in that spirit of being a leader for righteousness, what I think is Dr. King's greatest quotation, at least for me. And it is in what I think is his greatest piece of rhetoric, which is not Mountaintop for me or Letter from Birmingham Jail or the March on Washington speech. It is his sermon, A Tough Mind and a Tender Heart. That sermon changed my life. My parents put it on a wall when I was an adolescent, and now I've shared it with our Generation Z, disturber of the universe. Go, sisters, go. This is what Dr. King said. Rarely do we find people who willingly engage in hard, solid thinking. There is an almost universal quest for easy answers and half-baked solutions. Nothing pains some people more than having to think. So as I think and then try to act upon the King legacy rooted in a deep, flawed humanity, whose humanity is not flawed, who does not have feet of clay, even if you have a silver tongue. What I'm trying to do is do some serious thinking, some serious acting, and do it in a way that builds thick, diverse coalitions, especially of people whom history has marginalized and omitted. Perhaps tonight I will be able to rest well, Ella, Fannie Lou, and Coretta, because we know that the humanity of Martin was because he was in relationship.
Good evening. I am a Black Baptist ordained preacher standing in the need of prayer and always gripped by grace. I am Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Chicago Theological Seminary, and I see my ministry as that of a pastoral convener, bringing together faith leaders and those people of goodwill that have the same mission as our seminary. Part of the reason why I shared my music with your pastor is because I'm concerned about the humanity and the fate of faith leaders, those who are charged with serving others, those who people hold up on a pedestal, those people who deal with worry, anger, and fear. Who do they talk to? Who do they turn to? One of the great challenges of ministry is the isolation. I'm drawn to King because of an experience that I had as a young person wondering what it meant to be called by God. How could I accept such an awesome challenge? Who am I that this great big God would call to serve in ministry? And I shared that with my spiritual father and sage, Reverend Dr. Heiselby Taylor, and I said, well, I don't know about this thing, preaching. I don't think that I'm good enough. I don't think that's for me. And he looked at me and he mentioned Dr. King. And he said, Dr. King had many challenges in terms of his morality, and yet he still answered the call and he served. And so I'm grateful for that conversation, because I ask myself all the time, what if I said no? What if I did not take the opportunity to serve God's people? Who am I to take the light that God has given me and to hide it under a bushel? I marvel at Dr. King because he faced his fears, he dealt with his personal challenges, and he moved forward. Part of the great challenge is the fact that we mythologize great leaders. And we assume, because of what they have been able to accomplish, that we can't do the same thing. We're all blessed with gifts. We all have God-ordained opportunities to make a difference in the world. Who are we to tell God no, when God has blessed us with the gifting, the opportunity to make a difference in the world? And so, because of that conversation with that spiritual sage, I said yes. Not because I was perfect, and certainly even as I mentioned it today, we are all standing in the need of prayer. And so as a convener, not only do I serve faith leaders, but I journey with them. I have a unique opportunity to hear about their stories, their fears, their concerns, their congregations. But even in the midst of that, I'm able to help encourage them to move forward. And that is the life of King, one who struggled immensely with many personal challenges. And I'm fascinated by the fact that in his weakness, he was made strong. Think about the fact that even King had the opportunity to say no, and where would we be if he decided that fear was bigger than his destiny? And so I'm here today because of the humanity of King, the humanity of faith leaders, and the humanity of the individuals that are gathered here today. We all have an opportunity to be able to stand up and let our lights shine. If we could learn anything from these great works, it's the fact that we can make a difference. As Dr. Braxton mentioned, CTS was at the epicenter of one of those difference-making moments. CTS was the space where the Chicago breadbasket movement was born. Dr. King selected 3 seminary students: Reverend Gary Masoni, who is deceased, Reverend David Wallace, and someone who you're probably familiar with, Reverend Jesse Jackson. And all 3 said yes. And I had the opportunity to interview all of them, and they all spoke of Dr. King's commitment to humanity, his drive to see the beloved community, his desire to bring unity to the community. And so again, I'm here today because those individuals said yes to the call. And as I encourage you all this evening, whatever talents, skills, and gifts that you have, let this be a model for you to say yes to whatever it is you're being called to do.
Thank you. Did you want to get us started on questions, or should we just dive in? I want to talk a little bit about something that you just mentioned, the fear, and you talked about living with the fear and choosing to go on. One of the things that really moved me was the very first day of the Montgomery bus boycott, December 5th, 1955, when the people of Montgomery were deciding whether they could whether they could make this protest last. They had stayed off the buses for one day. And as you know, fear was what white Southerners had used to keep people in their place. The fear that if you raise your voice, you'll be struck down. The membership in the White Citizens Council doubled virtually the day the Montgomery bus boycott began. And the mayor and the chief of police were among those people who joined the White Citizens Council in response to the black community deciding to organize a protest. And when King was called that day, December 5th, to ask if he would speak to the crowd to try to encourage them to continue the boycott for another day, or at least another day, at least one more day, his initial reaction was, "Let me think about it." He had a 2-week-old baby at home. He had a new job, congregation to get used to. He had just turned down a request to join the board of the NAACP for the state chapter in Alabama. And he had to think about it. And when he thought about it, he knew he had to speak. He had to. His faith compelled him. His life, his experience compelled him. And when he got there to the church that day, first of all, he had 20 minutes to prepare his remarks. And he usually took about 8 hours to prepare a regular Sunday sermon. Now he had 20 minutes to prepare the most important speech of his life. And he had a panic attack. That's not an exaggeration. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. For the first 10 minutes, he was just in a cold sweat. And then he gathered himself and he jotted a few notes and he ran out the door and he got to the church. And there were thousands of people lining the streets. The church had already filled up and overflowed. And when he got to the podium finally, what he said really, in a way, addressed his own fears. He said, "We're not wrong in demanding justice. I recognize that you may feel like we're being told that what we're doing here is outrageous, dangerous, but we're not wrong. If we're wrong, then the Constitution is wrong. If we're wrong, the Supreme Court of the United States is wrong. If we're wrong, the Bible is wrong. Jesus is wrong." So what's he doing there? He's acknowledging the fears, but he's saying, let's draw on what we know to be true. Let's show the world that we, despite our fear, despite the way we've been treated for hundreds of years, we might be able to show the way with love toward a better community, toward fulfilling the empty promises of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. And that gives the people hope, and that gives the people the courage not to lose their fear, but to work through it. And that, to me, might be my, well, I said the Beyond Vietnam was my favorite, but that might be my favorite too, because it's really when he defines himself.
I mean, I'll just say quickly, and I'm sure it will keep the conversation going. Living with that fear and turning it into a source of strength actually made that power, because that struggle was able to win. There's another moment related to Montgomery, and it actually was 2 nights ago, November 13th, 1956. I think it's right after the Supreme Court issues the ruling that segregation is not constitutional in relation to public transportation in Montgomery. And the Klan comes out and parades around Montgomery. And a year on, I think this is something that reminds us that we've not only sanitized King, we've kind of sanitized the civil rights movement. We think that people got up and marched, and some people grumbled and maybe said some bad things, but basically, it was just a kind of procession, basically, to rights. Montgomery is the place in 1961, along with Birmingham and Anniston, where the Freedom Riders were beaten close to death. Montgomery is the place where people threw bombs at King and most of the leaders of the MIA, during this period. Montgomery was a violent, threatening, dangerous place, cradle of the Confederacy. People sat out on their porches and watched the King parade that night.
Klan parade.
Once the Klan, you're right, and once the Klan was going around. And they said, and I tried to track this in the book, how many times an individual black person said, "We are no longer afraid. We now have courage. We now feel that we can struggle and we don't worry about what's going to come." Another of King's most very, very important speeches, the speech on April 3rd. "I no longer fear any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." And I really do want to encourage us to think about that as a reference point in relation to these times, these fears. Once you're able to recognize that that fear is honestly earned because you understand that the world is a place that can visit you with harm and even with death. Once you have something to die for, which I think was something that Howard Thurman first formulated and so many people afterwards recognized as an important point to engage in struggle. Once you understand that, then you're capable of extraordinary things. And I think that's a resource that means that we never are finished with considering the example of these men and women, these boys and girls, who struggled and in many cases won because they were prepared to stake everything for justice.
In the spirit of the humanity of King, this movement, all of the relationships that made it possible, I want to ask you, Jonathan, to maybe do some hypothesizing here with us. And I want to think about humanity in terms of development. So again, in thinking about the rhetoric of King, the last Sunday sermon, remaining awake through a great revolution, which versions of it, those of you who have studied King know he did what we good preachers try to do. You get a couple good sermons and you put different saddles on them and you ride those horses in different places. So there were earlier versions he had preached of that, but a very radical piece of rhetoric actually as well, preparing for the Poor People's Campaign. But I think this image of remaining awake is very important to then problematize King the Dreamer and to ask some questions about how he might say, this part of it I got wrong. And the reason that I'm raising that is, as a literary scholar, I do a little history, but I'm not a professional historian like we have here in Adam. But I have been working with our community to think about some history here, that where we are as a country right now should not surprise anyone if you just situate, and I'm just going to talk about from the Civil War to right now. So at the end of the Civil War, there were 12, 13, 14 years, depending on how you count it, of some real progress, and then the country dipped down into some of its worst violence, and it took us 100 years to get out of that. And then this classic period that we're talking about, then the moral majority arises, and many of the things that we see today were orchestrated in the 70s and 80s, and they have been worked on for 4 decades. I am a dyed-in-the-wool progressive. We progressives, we get a couple of victories, and then we go back to sleep. Many other people work for decades. And I have a dear friend of mine, Dr. Tony Penn, who is a brilliant and prolific secular humanist. He's one of my conversation partners who has said, for all of the brilliance of King, for all of the brilliance of Obama, neither of them or their movements disallowed, prevented the moral majority, and it is precisely after the Obama presidency that we have the Trump era. So what do you think the dreamer who said to us, do not fall asleep through the Great Revolution, what might he and that generation have missed that allowed these things twice now, whether you're talking about the moral majority or the Trump movement, to come and to maybe in some sense eviscerate all of that great struggle?
I don't know that they missed it. I think they saw it and they recognized it, but I think that King still believed that the arc of the universe was bending toward justice. It's just that it didn't always look like it because you're living in it. And every time, these are backlashes that you're talking about. The backlash to freeing the slaves, the backlash to the March on Washington is what? The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, and the increased wiretaps on King's home and offices, right? These are backlashes. These are people who can't deal with the progress, can't deal with that bending of the arc, and want to fight back. But I think that they believed that that was inevitable, but it was just part of the process, and you just had to wait, and you had to keep fighting through it. So I don't know that they got it wrong. I would love to hear your thoughts. I still feel like they just understood that that was part of what they had to go through, that the victories weren't going to be easy. But look, even in King's short life, 39 years, his father had walked off the farm as a sharecropper. His own father. His grandmother had been the product of forced sexual relations to create more property for the slave-owning family. So he saw much more of an arc of progress than he saw the setbacks, I believe.
I think that the breadbasket movement represents his shift from simply civil rights now to economic rights. And I believe King saw an evolution in terms of what he believed his people needed. And so he said it's not enough just to have the right to be able to ride on a bus or to be able to walk down the street, but I need to own the bus. I need to own the homes that are on that street, and I need to own the businesses that line those streets. And so I think we underestimate what took place in the Chicago movement and the progress that was made. I think that we purposely try to diminish that because, of course, it's another thing to say, I need economic parity. There's no sacrifice in being fair and allowing people to live and to exist freely. But there is a sacrifice when you involve people in the economic activity of the community. And so I think we saw this shift, and then we saw a more violent reaction against him. And of course, dealing with the sanitation workers, I think people could see, oh my goodness, this man is going to really begin to make systemic progress that we won't be able to eliminate as easily. You saw the same thing with the bombing of Black Wall Street. Once these structures are put in place, now we have to become even more violent in order to remove them, because now people are becoming liberated, and more importantly, they become independent of us. And so I agree. I think that there was a shift taking place, and I think certain people noticed it and tried to intervene.
So I'm thinking about the sisters that need to be called into this space. Fannie Lou Hamer was clear in 1964 in Atlantic City at the Democratic Convention that if you didn't stop reaction from being able to capture some of the momentum out of the movement at that point, it would be difficult to maintain the momentum to win the struggle. And, in a sense, already you could see in 1964, even in a landslide victory against Barry Goldwater by Lyndon Johnson, the ways in which realignment was taking place politically. And that was called out plain by a woman who didn't have a high school education, who worked within a sharecropping family, who was beaten within an inch of her life in a jail 2 years before. I think there were many people who witnessed that even though the struggle was just and ennobling, that mistakes were being made at different moments that might lead to the inability to be able to achieve lasting victory. That feels like one thing to remember, is that we have to learn from those mistakes in that moment. Some of them were kings. I would say actually Atlantic City was more Bayard Rustin, a brilliant gay tactician of how to wage nonviolent struggle, who believed that the compromise at that moment would usher in a beloved community within the Democratic Party that would be a coalition of the working class, of African Americans and others. And it didn't happen. And that was a strategic mistake. So I feel like in some ways we're sort of thinking about tactics as much as we are thinking about values and principles. I just think that that's important to remember in terms of thinking about the times.
We have a few questions that are beginning to form online already, and I want to make it available if people want to ask questions inside of this space. The microphone's right over there. You can begin to form a line now, and so I'll pause there and let you all continue. One question that is coming related to what you just said, Adam, is do you think if MLK survived, he would have supported Jesse Jackson's run for president or stayed neutral?
So I'm going to pass that question. There's good, rich, complicated personal history between Dr. King and Reverend Jackson.
You got to use the mic so folks online can hear you.
I was just saying that there's rich personal history between Dr. King and Reverend Jackson, and so given that you did some interviews, I'm going to pass that over to Brian.
What would Dr. King say about his run for the presidency? Is that the question? Wow, what a difficult question. Let me say it like this. It's evident that Dr. King had a focus on developing what he called the beloved community. And his idea of the church was a space where we could bring together people of all classes, backgrounds, races, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to provide provisions for those who Howard Thurman terms as the disinherited. I would reserve judgment on saying what he would say about that specific event, but there's no question about Dr. King's commitment to peace and reconciliation for those who are lost. Based on my conversations with the individuals that work with him, Dr. King was one who remained faithful. Well, he was also one who was highly scientific in terms of how he moved forward. So he was very clear about his mission. And so if there was anything that would distract him from that cause, from that mission, I would assume that King would be reactive to that and will respond accordingly. I do think that he valued the separation between the prophetic and what we might consider to be secular. And what I mean by that is that he believed that the prophetic should be an influence on what's taking place in the community. He never wanted to be subject, and in fact, he wanted to be I want to choose my words carefully. He wanted to frame and direct the activities of community, and he did not want to be framed by them. And so I believe he would probably have some suspicion of systems, but I don't think that he would abandon the opportunity to work through them.
Hello, thank you all so much for this incredible talk. My name is Teddy Muckamal. I'm a student at Booth for MBA. I just wanted to ask Jonathan, as he has collected so many incredible stories about Dr. King, who was your favorite source of stories and information about his life, and was there one particular anecdote or memory that they relayed to you that really brought the humanity of Dr. King to you?
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. I had the great honor of meeting some of the legends, but I also got to know people who were not famous, like King's barber in Montgomery, who told me he was not a big tipper.
And he didn't make a lot of money.
He didn't make a lot of money, that's right. And I was very fortunate, too, in that I got to meet most of these folks before COVID hit, but then when COVID did begin, many of them were stuck at home, and I could call them all the time, and they had nothing else to do. So Reverend James Lawson, who was one of King's great friends and teachers, and the person who invited him to come to Memphis, taught a class on nonviolence in Los Angeles, and the class was shut down, and I basically asked him if I could take the class, and he did a one-on-one session with me every week for something like 10 weeks, and it was one of the great privileges of my life. But maybe my favorite person who I met and interviewed many, many times was King's childhood friend, June Dobbs Butts, who knew him from age 12 on, and who went on to become a sex therapist at Masters and Johnson. And she had a lot of interesting analysis of King's personal life. Her sister had dated Dr. King. Her best friend had been engaged to Dr. King. She still called him ML. So I just loved June and had a lot of really wonderful time talking to her.
Thank you to all the panelists for all that you have provoked and shared with us tonight. When the first Reagan administration, in the winter and spring of 1982, I was in the first offering of a course by Professor James Cone on Martin and Malcolm, and became the subject of one of his books. And I can't think about King without thinking about Malcolm X. And I can't think about Malcolm X without thinking about King. So could you say something about that relationship?
Yeah, I'd love to hear from some of the panelists on this, but James Baldwin said that by the end of their lives, they were virtually indistinguishable in their philosophies. That was his take on it. And I'll just tell you one story, and then I'd like to hear what you guys think about how their legacies align. One of the discoveries I made in my research is that the most commonly published quote that we have from Dr. King on what he thought about Malcolm X came from Alex Haley's Playboy magazine interview. And it's been reprinted in textbooks all over the place. And the quote says something like, he's asked Dr. King, what do you think of Malcolm X? And he says, I think his fiery demagogic oratory brings nothing but grief for black people. And when I tracked down the original transcript of that interview, I found that King never said that. That in fact, he had said that he thought Malcolm and I were engaged in the same struggle for black dignity, and the magazine intentionally altered the quote. And what I want to point out is that this was a part of the way the deck was stacked against King in ways that he never even could fully appreciate. He knew the FBI was surveilling his calls, but he didn't know that the FBI was leaking the transcripts of those calls and his hotel room tapes to members of the media, and how that tarnished his image. So when he gave the speech on April 4th, 1967 at Riverside Church and didn't understand why the press was dumping on him, he didn't understand fully that this was part of a concerted effort by the government to try to divide and conquer the civil rights movement, to try to keep the leaders from becoming aligned in a way that they might become more effective. And this is just one more frustration that he had in his life that felt personal to him, felt like the world is out to get him, and he could not see the vast machinations going on around him to try to make his life and his work more difficult. But yes.
Thank you so much for that question. And for me, it offers again an opportunity to take the historical glance back, as you've done, and situate and again in raising another great ancestral presence in Dr. Cone, who I know hovers over proceedings like this in the great life. It allows us not just to look back, but to look forward. And I think in this moment, particularly given the work that we are trying to participate in, for example, at Chicago Theological Seminary, that freedom fighting that makes a difference and that has any chance of lasting is going to have to be rooted in thick coalitions that transcend a number of barriers, in particular, in terms of your question, the religious identity barrier. So in some sense, to begin to talk about this legacy as those men are working out whatever they are working out, but to say those of us who are their progeny, and particularly with great warfare now going on in our world around these religious identities and claims to ancestral lands, that this is one of the great moral questions again of our day. What does it look like, particularly given the rise of Christian nationalism, for those of us who are in Christian traditions to say, who's missing from this conversation? How can we keep lifting up the Christian grammar and not talking about the grammar that comes from the Quran or the grammar that comes from secular humanists? And so thank you for helping us to say that looking back, there was an interesting moment of interreligious conversation and fellowship and friction and development and respect and all of that happened. And then what does it look like for us going forward to build thick coalitions that problematize and resist any nationalistic movement that tries to supplant all of this diversity in the name of a malformed and deformed Christianity?
Just really quickly on that, amen. Fundamentalism is a problem. And fundamentalism has been a problem in relation to how religion, often Christian religion, but not only Christian religion, how religion has warped and distorted the ways in which we can imagine an expansive and embracing community. And Howard Thurman really taught me that, and I'm trying to sort of think about this in terms of some projects that I'm working on in relation to his thinking. King was not a fundamentalist. In a really profound way, Malcolm X was not a fundamentalist. And I think this is often misrecognized in terms of thinking about his course, his evolution, his spiritual journey, his witness in relation to what he was looking at. When you stop and think about it, that thick coalition, that righteous struggle is counter-fundamentalist very, very consistently. And so, that feels like something to pull. It's the hypothetical of, what would Martin Luther King say in San Francisco or wherever the '88 Democratic Convention was at watching Jesse Jackson won for president, similar kind of conversation about what would Malcolm X and Martin Luther King say about each other as their spiritual journeys deepened and evolved, had they lived, and they did not. I think it would have been against fundamentalism as a constraint in some way, somehow, and that certainly is something to struggle against in so many places, in so many ways right now.
Okay. Hi, my name is Anne Willie. Hi, Adam. So I first wanted to say thank you for this book. I really, I've been listening to it with my 16-year-old and just really interested in how your portrayal of King makes so much sense to him. And I think right now, especially, that's a 16-year-old boy, and that's an age group that I think people feel like they can't reach. And I think the way that you portrayed him really did a lot to open up conversations with my son, so I thank you for that. And this has been a really great conversation. And in listening to you, I came in with a question because we listened to it on audiobook, and I was really struck to hear that King discussed a love ethic. And you bring up King's love ethic and his sort of lineage of thought, how he studied, who he studied. And I hadn't ever thought about lines of theological inquiry in that way, that theologians are also thinking about real world problems and not just looking at the Bible over and over again. I was particularly struck because during the pandemic, a lot of people read All About Love by Bell Hooks. And I, in particular, read this and started a whole project about the love ethic without realizing that this was something she got from King. She didn't say that. And so I was curious if you could just talk more about the love ethic and the ways in which theologians think about things outside of the Bible, and why you think it becomes so disconnected from more mainstream discussions that are happening.
I wonder if one of the theologians might want to go first on this, because my answer will be a more practical one, because I think King grew into what he studied and what he learned in the Bible. And when he began, so I'm going to be brief because I really want to hear what my colleagues here have to say, but when he began emerging as a leader of not just of a church, but of a movement where he had to reach and work with a whole wide audience, I think he began to appreciate the practical applications of love as opposed to the scholarly, the theologian, the preacher. Suddenly he was also an activist and a leader of a very diverse community. And I think he began to see in a really practical way the power of how love could help him expand his work. And he said over and over again that he never thought of himself as an activist. He thought of himself as a minister, and that his ministry just kept growing. And I think love became more important as a tool as his ministry grew. But I'm going to leave it to these wise men.
Wise man, that's the learning thing. In our wonderful exchange, even before the program, one of the things that I mentioned was when I have the opportunity to teach Dr. King specifically and the broader legacy and relationships that were a part of the movement, I often use respectfully a phrase, and I say, I'm teaching King, and I want to avoid the super Negro phenomenon. Because we often approach King as if he's this one singular super Negro who just kind of appears sui generis, one of a kind. And the way I reframe it is, I suggest that King is actually the brilliant, certainly brilliant, flowering of a very sturdy stalk that's very deeply rooted. And in particular, as a scholar of Scripture, a biblical scholar by training, one of the things that I would say is that King is part of a larger Black, in this case specifically Christian tradition, that understands it is necessary to play jazz with the Scriptures in order for them to be the best witness to God's inclusive intentions. This is my language now, that the the scriptures are ambiguous at best. Some days they misbehave. Some days they are great intentions to God's witness. And so there's a marvelous moment in one of King's pieces of rhetoric where he does a brilliant interpretation of the Good Samaritan and this story about traveling on a dangerous road. And what you see is he begins to insert a love and justice ethic and say the Good Samaritan is a wonderful story because you go and you bind up someone who's fallen down. But the real question is, why does the world keep having Jericho roads? We don't just need charity to attend to somebody who's victimized. We need to ask about oppressive systems that victimize. And that tradition of playing jazz and working with the scriptures and inserting into them a justice ethic for the contemporary moment, because many of these texts had a justice ethic in their ancient writing, is a brilliant move that many made long before King and taught King. So part of what I wanted to do in my response to you is to situate this developmental theory is really rooted in, again, relationship and a tradition that he did not create. He inherited it and certainly refined it, but he didn't create it. Many, many brilliant interpreters were making these moves and taught him these moves, and not all of them were his teachers at Boston University as well. There was a lot of grassroots things that were happening that helped him, and I think most importantly, Howard Thurman in this case is the one who asked, how do you understand Jesus if your back is against the wall? So many people were reading scripture out of this black Christian tradition in profound ways, not only in terms of the love ethic, but in terms of a justice ethic.
One of the things that I try to remind myself of, especially when convening all sorts of people, is that religion is supposed to be a mechanism for bringing us into relationship with God and with each other. Sometimes we begin to idolize the mechanism and we forget about the goal, which is for us to connect with God, the ultimate supreme being, and to connect with our brothers and sisters. And when there's a disconnection, we have a problem. And so love then becomes that pathway of connection. And I try to remind myself of that in any context. Are we connecting? I was sharing with our president when he was making his way here, he was looking for this building. And so I went outside to find him rather than give him directions over the phone. Religion is the direction, but love is going outside, grabbing that individual by the hand and saying, come on in. And that's something that we have to remind ourselves of. We have these faith traditions, we have these pathways, but are we going outside? Going into the spaces where the people are and reaching out to them and saying to them, I'm with you. I want to be connected with you. I want to be in relationship with you. That is love.
Can I get one in real quick? The question's beautiful partly because of the work that informs the question, your work as a parent, but also directing development for the Invisible Institute, all of the amazing work that's done in terms of raising children's stories up today about injustice. You know, that is continuing that legacy. It's a tall, mighty, nourishing stalk that King is on. Somebody always has to continue to water it, though. And maybe one of the things that I'll just say humbly is that a number of the stories, the story about the Klan parading and people, waving at them from the porch, the story about not being able to buy the shoes and Daddy King explaining about segregation in the South,
So many of these stories I recall from a very short book, probably when I was 9 or 10. That was one of the first books that I can remember reading about history and about the struggle. And it was a children's book about King. And it, just reminds me that, again, work that we can do is not just public work, not just prominent work, not just political work. Political king, personal king. It's also about teaching our children that we live with fear and we can overcome it. Teaching children that we can live in these thick relationships and realize both justice and humanity through that. But also teaching our children that they do not need to look at someone like Martin Luther King and believe that he is mighty and they are nothing. There's an equivalence, and clearly you're doing that with your boy, and we all need to do that. We all need to look both for these stories and then the stories around us politically of people doing things that involve great sacrifice, confronting great fears, fighting against great injustices, to recognize that there's an equivalence, there's a peerage in the ways in which we engage in those struggles through these relationships. So thank you for sharing that.
We'll take a couple more questions.
Well, yeah, my question is, why did you write this book?
Why did I write this book?
Well, let me go back to what motivated you to take on Dr. King and write a book about it? There's been other books about him.
There have been a lot of terrific books about
I know
Dr.
that.
King. Well, it was really simple, actually. I was working on a book about Muhammad Ali, and I found myself interviewing people who knew Martin Luther King, and I just found it fascinating that these people hung out with Martin Luther King, and they knew what kind of cigarettes he smoked, and what kind of music he liked to listen to in the car when they drove, and they talked about the fact that he was a very messy eater, and I just, oh my God, he was a real person? His feet smelled? I remember I asked one of his friends, what did he smell like? And the guy just laughed. He said, nobody's ever asked me that before. I said, good, that means I'm getting somewhere. And that was it. It was really just the idea that there were still hundreds of people alive who knew him. And so it really began just first with, I want to talk to those people. And I didn't know whether there was room for another book on the shelf. And then I just decided, why not? Let's try it. I think the world might want to connect with him in a more humane way. And then I began to become a little bit scared, to be honest. What if people don't want to, as you were saying, what if people don't want to read about his flaws? What if people we prefer to keep him on the mountaintop? What if we prefer just to keep the statue and but I've been really I've been really pleased, I shouldn't say surprised, I've been really pleased that the response to the book has been overwhelmingly supportive, that people feel when they read about his struggles, when they read about the fact that he attempted suicide twice as an adolescent, or that he was hospitalized for what was probably clinical depression at times, but he just called exhaustion, that people can relate to him better when they hear those stories, and they can take inspiration from that, and they can feel like our heroes don't have to be perfect. If we expect perfection, we can't have any heroes. And I think Dr. King, for most of the readers I've spoken to, and I've been all over the country for the last year and a half, I think people love him and respect him and admire him even more when they hear about him as a human being.
Last question? Holy mackerel.
Make it a good one.
I'd like to loop back to the moment in which we live, November of 24, and think about King as the problem of the melodramatic heroism of King that tends to confuse who he was and what he meant. Because I think there are many moments in history where collectively we have the sense that we have reached a moment of critical collective decision-making. But one of the things we need is the person who can articulate, speak, help us recognize and therefore reflect upon that moment of vague, critical decision that confronts us. My wife Nancy and I got married and were driving back to where I was in Theological Seminary at the time in Lexington, Kentucky. And the first night we were driving along, we decided to stop in Memphis, Tennessee. And there was a sanitation workers' strike going on at that time, and it was late March of 1968. And a week later, Martin Luther King was assassinated there. As I continued in seminary, I realized that there were only 3 books, or 3 sets of readings, I'll say, that all of us were reading that weren't assigned in class. The books we just picked up because we needed to read them. Some of those were famous lectures of Martin Luther King. Another set of things we all read was the heroic advocate or resistor against the Nazi German regime, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his letters and papers from prison. And the third was the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber in his book I and Thou. And as I thought about that going through school, why are we reading these 3 unassigned readings? It occurred to me that all 3 in their own way were the articulators of the sense we had that we were in a pivotal year of our educations, of the decisions that confronted us ahead, that were not temporary decisions, that were lifelong decisions about our identity, about who we were going to become. And so I guess what I want to ask is a little bit about how we think about these articulators of the moment of decisive crisis and the words that must be spoken to help the rest of us coalesce our thoughts, reflect on where we are and what we must do.
I don't know, is there, you want to start? I don't feel like that's, Adam's got something percolating there.
So I will take it and then pass it to Adam. So
Go ahead.
as I was listening with my third ear to the brilliant narrative framing that you provided and how I can imagine this conversation touches you as you just think about the materiality of that trip you're taking in 68. The piece that I would, my metaphor often is to play jazz with is, maybe looking back, this was a little bit of a challenge, but I think certainly looking forward, the democratization of information, dis and misinformation, made possible by technology, that alone, let alone the ethical implications of what I'm about to say, might encourage us to problematize the search for individual spokespersons. That itself might be some of the challenge of this moment, insofar as, for example, in the current election, and I want to report the news, I'm not going to try to editorialize here, but many of the engines that influenced many people who made decisions were not unauthorized channels of information. As one of our colleagues said so powerfully yesterday at Chicago Theological Seminary, even now, some of our storied journalistic institutions were compromised in this election. And that's in the legacy of King, let's call it what it is. The Washington Post needs to be looked at a little askew right now. So I just wanted to raise that notion of thinking about creating such a revolutionary movement that it saturates into all the places. And maybe, the notion of messianic leadership itself may need to be problematized and thought through in different kinds of ways. Yes.
And I would just add to that before we turn it to Adam, that Adam actually mentioned earlier that one of King's great gifts was his ability to open minds, make people listen to him, encourage people to think about where they might have blind spots, where they might have been prejudiced, where they might be able to change. And King had this power, perhaps better than any American of his time, in part because he was calling on us to think as a community, to not just think of ourselves. And that seems harder than ever in this environment that you're describing, where we are all getting our news and our information from the places that make us most comfortable. King was able to challenge us to think differently, to challenge our own biases, and think about how we could be a better world if we actually showed some compassion for one another. And that seems almost absurd today, but I think if we could listen to King in those divided times, then we can maybe do it again today.
King struggled, as many people did during this period, with lies and lying. And we are struggling with lies and lying. And finding a way to have truth out, as Shakespeare said, is, in a sense, also very, very challenging and difficult politically, because at that moment, King was dealing with a government that would tap his phone, agents that would call his wife, provocateurs who were also agents that would encourage him a third time to try suicide, right? Misinformation and attempts to confound him and others, and now us, about what we understand truth to be. And I don't know that there's as eloquent and powerful as moving as the way that you formulated it. I don't know if there's an answer in a book or from a particularly incisive thinker that can guide us. I think I go back to the stalk and the plant and the need to water and tend and nurture. We may have to pass this moment along with care to others to be able to harvest the fruit of realizing justice, realizing truth, and affirming humanity. We may not be the ones who are able to overcome this. But and I feel so moved and fortunate to be in company, in conversation with the three of you and with all of you here. We've come back again and again to the fact that King, this giant, stood on shoulders himself. So if we cannot be the prophet or the oracle or the voice or the leader that somehow is able with others to create change, then let's be the shoulders. And let's be strong in relation to being those shoulders.
As a convener, I believe that leaders emerge through coalitions. One of the great challenges that I see is that we're looking for this singular leader to come out on the mountaintop and lead us, when in fact we are the leaders, or we are the leader makers. So one of the things that I try to do is I try to challenge great thinkers to come together regularly, prayerfully before there's a crisis, to convene regularly, to share ideas. And you can see right now, one of the first assaults is on our education system, to stop people from going into spaces where there's dialogue, where we're having conversations, where we're reviewing history. Another trick that I see is to develop divisions between the older and the younger. I was so grateful to hear the parent, she's no longer here. Oh, yes. I was so grateful to hear you say that you connected with your son. I have a 17-year-old. And one of the things that I discovered is that even when we think they aren't listening, they are. How many of you have a young person in your life, on your block? It's the mundane periods when we think that they aren't listening that they receive what we're presenting. And believe me, they are very concerned about what's happening in the world right now. So what I've learned to do is to make it a matter of constant conversation. Hopefully my son is watching now, but let's commit to being in conversation, particularly with those communities that maybe we are unfamiliar with. Continue the conversation. I think that's why Dr. Braxton and I were so eager to come here today. We're eager to bring together high-level thinkers and concerned citizens to talk about the challenges we face. And I believe if we continue to do that, a leader will emerge among us. Perhaps that leader is your son. And our job is to cultivate an environment, a community where that leader can be nourished and we can raise that leader up. We have to understand that Dr. King grew up in a context. There were leaders within his family. Daddy King was a powerful leader. His grandmother and mother, they were powerful in music ministry. We don't know who that leader is yet, but we are charged with creating an environment where coalitions can thrive, and perhaps, and I'm a Christian, perhaps God is waiting for us to create that space to raise up that leader. Maybe that leader is in a basket on the Nile, and God is waiting for us to take that little baby out of the basket and nurture them and develop them to become the leader that we need going forward. Oh my goodness.
That's the reason that I added the name of Martin Buber. Yes. Because in I and thou, there is a capital T on that vowel. And the point was, there is a voice to which we must listen. So there is a distinctly theological dimension in that sense, and leaders emerge first and foremost out of the capacity to hear, to listen, to reflect, and collectively, as you all have said so eloquently tonight, coalesced the possibility of an honest, faithful, resilient response. Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you. Friends, will you join me in giving thanks for the conversation that we have had? In the same way that no Sunday service can last forever. We try, though. We try, don't we? We try. Sometimes we just got one more thing to say. Just in the same way that no one meal can feed us forever, no one conversation is enough. But this conversation is enough for this moment. And this has been food for us. And so I am grateful to each of you and the perspective that you bring and the insight and the spirit that you all bring and have brought into this space. We'll continue to have conversations in this season, and you'll be invited to them. We'll do more than talk as well. We'll continue to wrestle together as coalitions to figure out what must be done to respond or to build without waiting for any action to happen, knowing what we must do without waiting for them to do something, without thinking about us and them. What can we do to build the beloved community? That's what this church is about, and we want to work and be in community with whoever wants to be in community with us. I promise you, we're here to do that work. Thank you again for being here this evening. So are you available to sign some books? So in the back that we have a few books. If you'd like to get one, they're right there as soon as you walk out. I think that's it. Thank you very much for coming, and good night.
I'm in a hurry. When I saw you last, I had heard you had surgery, and I wanted to ask how you were, but I was needing to be where I was